Good evening, welcome. We're honoured that Policy Exchange should be able to be the scene of Alexander Downer's valedictory address as High Commissioner. Pleasure us to welcome him here for so many reasons, not least because he's one of the most popular members of the Corps Diplomatique here in London, but also because he's been perhaps the most effective High Commissioner of Australia in recent years. As all of you will know, he's the longest serving foreign minister in the history of the Commonwealth to stay on that surfboard for 11 years, and the contact sport that is Australian politics must be a sign of a certain kind of genius. So we commend you for that, and we hope that you can stay, as you're now staying on in London, stay on the surfboard for a record 11 years as chairman of the trustees of Policy Exchange, following from that an even more challenging role. As we all know, we're delighted you'll be taking over in a few weeks. The prospect of you actually taking over as chairman is constantly tantalisingly held in front of us and then dashed away, as the Sydney Morning Herald points out today. So you will be here for a few more weeks and in your present job, and we look forward to taking over. I've always liked having absentee landlords as chairman, so but anyhow, it's a pleasure. We want to hear your thoughts. 4 years in London. You've had the longest experience of this country at school, at university. Your father, obviously, as High Commissioner before you. There is a Downer room in the High Commission in the Australia House named for him, and his record of affection and service to this country, of course, foreshadowed your own. So thank you for coming tonight, and the audience here on this last night of the parliamentary session. It's a sign that people are keen to hear what you've got to say, and we look forward to giving you the platform. Thank you.
Well, thanks very much, Dean, and let me say it's a great honour to have been asked to give a valedictory speech here, and to have been asked also to take over when I finish as the High Commissioner as the chairman of this august organisation. And I'm not sure that I can promise you that I will be an absentee landlord. I don't approve of absentee landlords, so I think I will have to keep a steady eye on how the organisation develops. My 4 years as the High Commissioner for Australia in London have been, to say the least, a wonderful experience. As I've often said to others, this is the most senior job that I've ever had, but in many respects it's been the best. London, after all, isn't just a great city in so many ways. It remains the capital of the world in finance, in performing arts, in sport, and for its sheer intellectual gravitas. I'd regard myself, by the way, as a bit of a political junkie, as someone who loves almost any manifestation of politics and political combat. I follow elections wherever they take place all over the world, though with less enthusiasm in countries where the result is, of course, a foregone conclusion, like Russia. I'll come back to Russia a bit later. But how lucky for somebody who is a political junkie like me that I've been in the UK for 2 general elections and 2 referenda. It's been just so exciting. The chances are that my successor, George Brandis, will serve his 3 or 4 years without a referendum and without a general election. Well, we'll see anyway. I hope you won't regard me as being tonight too presumptuous in making a handful of observations about the UK and its politics. Now, of course, I wouldn't normally do this as a diplomat. I've been keeping these thoughts to myself for a long time. But since my time as a diplomat has just 1 month to run, I thought I might take a bit of a risk. Now, some of you, I'm absolutely sure, are going to disagree with what I have to say. So please promise me you won't retreat into a safe space, but instead be prepared to argue with me. And don't blame the Australian government for anything that I say. Some of you may know that my father was the High Commissioner in London between 1964 and the end of 1972. For him, who was very much a son of the British Empire, this was a sad period. I mean, this is just what he thought. I don't want you to interpret it as what I think. In the late 1960s, the Wilson government decided to withdraw from east of Suez, and my father saw this as the ultimate statement of British decline. Britain no longer wanted to be a great global power, and was retreating into becoming little more than a regional player. For his generation, the decision by the British government to join the EEC was a symbol of British withdrawal from the world to Europe. At the practical level, I'd have to say Australian exporters suffered grievously as a result of Britain joining the EEC, but also over the following decades, British trade progressively diverted away from markets like Australia to Europe for very obvious reasons. And then for my father's generation, there was the issue of visas. Gradually, the British government gave preference to European Union nationals over Australians, Canadians and New Zealanders. Given the heritage of so many Australians like my father, you can imagine how people like him felt about this. So all this was encapsulated in a remark Roy Jenkins made to my father during a heated debate they had at a diplomatic function at Hampton Court over what my father saw as the diminishing role of Britain in the world and its links with its traditional family countries. Jenkins angrily shook his fist at my father and said, "I have no time for kith and kin politics." You can imagine my father, who'd been in the Australian Imperial Force fighting for the British Empire during the Second World War and spent 3.5 years in the Changi prison of war camp on a very successful military career. You can imagine how he felt about that. It's an incontestable fact that over those years since the late 1960s, when Britain withdrew from east of Suez and eventually joined the European Union, British foreign policy has focused much less on the world beyond Europe. Now, I know some in the Foreign and Commonwealth Office disagree with this, and after all, the UK was an active participation in the Iraq and Afghanistan wars, and still is, of course, involved in Iraq and Afghanistan. I just want to say this to you, though. I was the Foreign Minister of Australia for very nearly 12 years, and never during that period did a British Foreign Secretary come to Australia. And my personal observation during my time as the Foreign Minister was that Britain seldom became engaged in the major issues of East Asia and the Pacific. So I tell you all that by way of background. When I arrived in London as the High Commissioner, I did so with relatively low expectations of the priority Britain would give to Australia and an Australian High Commissioner. As it turned out, I was completely wrong. And look at Michael Fallon here, for example, who was one of the people who welcomed me so warmly in his time as the Defence Secretary. For a start, I received a very warm welcome from a number of ministers and senior officials. Within 2 days of being in the post, the then Foreign Secretary, William Hague, called me to his office and spent an hour of his valuable time with me. But there was something else I discovered very quickly, and it was that the great mainstream of the British public have a huge affection for Australia. It might have diminished a bit in the last week for reasons that maybe our own affection for parts of Australia has diminished in the last week. For all the redirection of British foreign and economic policy since the late 1960s, the public remain firmly attached to relations with countries like Australia, New Zealand and Canada. Of course, they see us as sporting rivals, but that's in a sense there is that sense of family exuded by the British public towards us that doesn't translate to other relationships beyond Canada and New Zealand. I noticed this very early in my time here as I travelled around the country. For most of you, look, this isn't going to be a particularly important observation, but having been a politician for many years myself, it made me wonder whether there wasn't some sort of disconnect between the opinions of mainstream British society and the elites who dominate the nation's major institutions, the Parliament, the civil service, the BBC, the media, academia, and even parts of the professions. I think it's fair to say in Australia there is at times, from time to time, that sort of disconnect. My second observation of the UK after I arrived all those years ago was the way immigration and ethnic relations had been handled, and the fact, I'm not being critical of that particularly, but I noticed that it did grate with a substantial proportion of the population. Over quite some years, it was apparent that there had only been a very limited effort to integrate migrants into the mainstream of British society. Indeed, for me as an outsider who comes from essentially a migrant country, or overwhelmingly so, it was quite striking to see how ethnic groups were so heavily concentrated in different suburbs and towns of the country. I visited East Birmingham not long after I was here with the West Midlands Police. And I was surprised how an immigrant community had their own street and shop signs, schools, places of worship, of course, you'd have that, social activities, sports teams, and had barely any contact with mainstream Britain outside of that particular community. Now, these same concerns, I must tell you, are issues for Australia. We've sometimes failed to integrate migrants, particularly where those migrants have no successful command of the English language. In those circumstances, they concentrate in separate communities, and they have struggled to advance in broader Australian society. So for us as Australians, successful integration of migrants is axiomatic. We do, simplifying it a lot, two things. First of all, we have a coherent immigration policy under which we decide who comes to our country and the circumstances in which they come. And secondly, we do insist that migrants speak English. It doesn't have to be their native language, but they need to learn English. For most of the British population, the lack of integration, I judge, has been a bit disquieting. Contrary to the views of many in the commentariat, I think the British are very accepting of people of all races and religions, and I really welcome that. But it's not entirely clear to me that the elite here understand that in Britain there is great pride in the country's traditions and institutions. Now, tolerance, of course, is one of the country's core values, and it's spread tolerance to so much of the world as a core value. The public, however, seem to see the separation of migrant communities as an attempt to put people into silos, not to integrate them. There is, I suspect, a lot of quiet resistance to building social silos. There'd be much broader acceptance of migrants being welcomed into society, provided they were integrated and encouraged to embrace the core values and traditions of Britain. And I've noticed, while I've been here, the two Prime Ministers have quite often made the point about the importance of migrants embracing the core values of the country. When I was first here, I sort of accepted the view that there was greater opposition to immigration in the UK than there is in Australia. Australia, though, as I've already said, is overwhelmingly a migrant country, so it's likely to be more embracing of immigration prima facie. But Australia also has within its society most of the same values as the UK. Therefore, I think, looking at it the other way around, it would have been surprising if in the UK people were more intolerant of immigration than in Australia. So I thought there must be something more to it than superficially appeared to be the case. In the end, I concluded that although there was resistance to immigration in the UK, especially amongst lower socio-economic groups, the reason for that opposition was this lack of effective effort to integrate migrants into British society. As a result, some Indigenous Britons felt that their national identity was being threatened by migrants. Now, a lot of people say that all that matters in politics is economics. I just want to emphasise that this is a great myth. People do have a strong sense of national identity, and in this country I discovered, for all the understated, sometimes also pessimism that you find here, there's a quiet and very strong patriotism which lurks just beneath the surface. What seems to have happened here, as in, by the way, other English-speaking countries, is that generations of leaders have played down the country's national identity and replaced it with an enthusiasm for what you might call identity politics. Instead of building on an existing national identity by working to integrate migrants into the mainstream of society, society's somewhat been salami sliced with an ideology of identity politics. The great cry of Martin Luther King to judge people by the content of their character, not the colour of their skins, seems sometimes by some people to have been forgotten. Now, look, in defence of the people who have made a lot of these decisions over generations, their enthusiasm for identity politics is about trying to rectify inequalities and disadvantage in society, and that obviously is a very laudable objective. But it might have been wiser to try to achieve that in a more consensual way, building on notions of egalitarianism and national identity. Now, I'll tell you all of that because I'm trying to understand the Brexit referendum, and I've read again what the commentariat has said and the explanations that are given for why people voted, the majority of people voted the way they did. I think, at least in some part, it was this concern about the playing down of national identity, not just questions of wealth distribution and wages growth, that led so many people to vote to leave the European Union. In the Australian government, by the way, we thought it would be better if the UK remained in the European Union. We judged that the European Union would become less pragmatic, less economically liberal, more protectionist, less global in outlook and less transatlantic if Britain were to leave it. For Australia, a European Union without the UK would be a more difficult entity to deal with. But for mainstream Australia, Britain outside the European Union sounded like an enticing proposition. For many, the idea of negotiating a free trade agreement with the UK was attractive, and for older Australians, people from my father's generation, it seemed that the traditional ties with Britain would be stronger, with Britain less committed to the EU. So far, there's no doubt that officials in London have become more interested in my country and others like it since the Brexit vote. They've embraced the idea of an FTA, a free trade agreement between Australia and the UK, and there's every chance that we could conclude negotiations for such an agreement before the end of the implementation period in December 2020. This assumes, of course, that the UK leaves the customs union. Mind you, I'd be surprised, and I have been surprised actually, that there is any debate at all about whether Britain remains in the customs union. Imagine a great country like this having its trade policy determined by bureaucrats and politicians in Brussels without the British government or the British people having any say whatsoever in international trade policy. Imagine free trade agreements being negotiated by the EU without having any say as to the terms of those agreements, yet being subjected to the terms of those agreements. Within Britain, you may describe yourselves in such circumstances as rule takers. For us in the outside world, Britain would become, at least in economic terms, irrelevant to international diplomacy. All our trade negotiating would be done through Brussels and the capital cities of the major EU member states, knowing that whatever we negotiated with Brussels would apply to the UK, but the opinion of the UK would be irrelevant. You'd be better off remaining within the EU or being completely out of it than leaving yourselves in such a position of weakness and irrelevancy. It'd be humiliating for a great country to end up by being little more than a dependency of the European Union. So we very much hope you'll not go down that path. If you did, you wouldn't be negotiating any free trade agreement with Australia, but let's assume you do not commit such an act of folly. Whether it will be possible to complete a bilateral free trade agreement with Australia quickly will depend on the extent to which the UK wishes to have a free and open approach to trade. From Australia's perspective, we'd willingly give away any tariff protection and provide improved access to our services market, as well as create a better investment environment for British investors. We'd expect this very liberal approach to be warmly reciprocated. Now, all sorts of questions have been raised with me about a bilateral free trade agreement. For example, people want to know whether we would demand that the British adopt all our quarantine and food standards. What we would expect is that British exports to Australia would be subjected to our standards as they currently are. We'd be quite happy for our exports to the UK to meet British standards. That's the way it is at the moment, and that is the way we'd expect it to continue. The only qualification to all of this is that standards must be scientifically defensible, not used as some sort of artificial form of replacing tariff protection. I'm also asked whether Australia would flood the British market with agricultural products. Well, we already have huge markets in Asia, which we can't satisfy, so the chances of diverting trade to the UK for agricultural products are very low. It's much more likely we'd target specialty markets such as certain citrus fruits, which would go into the UK duty-free, whereas at the moment they're subjected to substantial EU tariffs. And we could sell Australian-made RM William boots more cheaply. Both David Cameron and Sir Mark Sedwell, the National Security Advisor, like to wear RM Williams boots, so when they replace them, they'll be able to get them duty-free thanks to the free trade agreement with Australia. And I guess the current Prime Minister could buy Australian shoes more cheaply. I think I've ever seen her wear Australian shoes. A pair of kangaroo-hide shoes, I think, would look great. And finally, some people say that a free trade agreement with Australia is not worth much because Britain doesn't have much trade with Australia. Now, that is true at the moment because UK trade is diverted to the EU. But if Britain can maintain free trade with the EU and build trade agreements with other parts of the world, including Australia, then this has to be a win-win outcome for the UK. It will improve Britain's market access worldwide, plug the UK into the fastest growing markets in the world, and ensure that investment within the UK directs itself into the most profitable and therefore the most wealth-creating and job-creating of endeavours. Our experience in Australia is that free trade agreements can be negotiated quite quickly with countries like the United States, Singapore, Chile and Peru. Negotiations with Japan and China have taken us longer, but now the precedent has been set, a country like the UK should be able to negotiate relatively quickly with markets of that size. And let me make one final point about trade negotiations. Australia is the 12th biggest economy in the world, but it's very much smaller, obviously, than the United States and China. This hasn't been, contrary to what many people here would imagine, a problem for us in negotiations with those countries. Quite the contrary. Because our economy is substantially smaller than theirs, they see exports from Australia as very little threat to their substantial local industries. Now, the UK's economy is twice the size of Australia's, but even so, British exports are not going to be anything like the threat to local industries in America and China that exports from the whole of the EU would be. Looked at the other way around, we judge that opening our market to imports from the United States and China duty-free is to our advantage. We get goods and services cheaper and of a higher quality than might otherwise have been the case. This contributes to improving the living standards of working people in Australia, but it does much more than that. Opening markets to the outside world makes your country a very attractive place for foreign investors. Since we concluded our free trade agreement with the United States some 12 years ago, Australia's trade with the United States has grown by around 50%. But significantly, the bilateral investment relationship has grown by 130%. So our experience is that free trade agreements are not just about building trade in goods and services. They're very substantially about encouraging investment flows, and it's investment which ultimately creates jobs and national wealth. Now, because the UK hasn't negotiated trade agreements for over 40 years, there's a distinct, but I don't think understandable, lack of national self-confidence, particularly in the media, about Britain's capacity to negotiate trade agreements. You shouldn't be without confidence. This is something you can do, and you can do relatively easily, provided you yourselves wish to open your markets to the outside world. You like to beat us at sport, so for heaven's sake, don't let us beat you at trade negotiating. The third observation I'd make about the UK is that there is a surprising lack of debate here about domestic economic reform. Let me explain what I mean. In my book, calling for more government expenditure funded through ever-growing debt doesn't really constitute an economic policy. I mean, anyone can say that. Economics, after all, you might recall, is about the allocation of scarce resources. Good economic policy is about finding the right allocation of those resources and contributing to solid economic growth which lifts living standards. To be fair to Australia, periods of economic difficulties have led to improved public debate on economic policy. Political parties in Australia can no longer get away with promising to spend bucket loads of money to solve social problems without identifying where that money is going to come from. The public really care about where the money is going to come from. Claiming that a few rich people are going to provide enough money through higher taxes to finance massive infrastructure projects, a stronger health system, free university education, higher pensions, and so the list goes on. I have to tell you, that wouldn't pass muster in Australia. There is, on the other hand, ongoing debate about how to improve the efficiency of the Australian economy. We do discuss the tax system. Of course it has to be fair, but on the other hand, it has to be conducive to attracting investment and making sure that investment decisions are relatively neutral economically. Civil servants and politicians are hardly the best judges of where to make profitable investments. I've been both a civil servant and a politician. You should look at my investment portfolio. So not only is the tax system constantly debated, but so is the way our labour market works. We want workers to be paid as much as is humanly possible, obviously. But on the other hand, capacity to pay varies from firm to firm, industry to industry, and region to region. So we constantly debate how to have a labour market which is fair to employees, but also fair to employers. There's no point in having a labour market which makes it impossible to get rid of workers who are holding a business back, thereby denying employers the opportunity to employ someone else who's more productive. On the other hand, willfully dismissing people is hardly conducive to a stable and fair society. So we're always trying to get the right balance, seldom succeeding, but nevertheless always trying. You have a fine goose in the City of London. You need to keep that goose laying its golden eggs so that London can remain the greatest financial centre the world has ever known. Embracing the politics of envy and over-regulating and attacking the city is only going to kill the goose that keeps laying those eggs. You should be nervous about doing that because you'd blow a huge hole in the British economy if you were to behave in that way. My last words about Britain are about its place in the world. It's my view that there is no country on earth which has more soft power than the UK. Your media, particularly led by the BBC, is seen as a benchmark by the rest of the world. British arts, British education, which I benefited from, the reputation of Britain's political system, which is much higher outside of Britain than it is in Britain, and also the perception, I think very accurate perception, that your legal system is as good, if not better, than any other legal system in the world, gives Britain huge influence. Add to that the proficiency of your armed forces, the fact that you spend 2% of your GDP on defence, and the existence, dare I mention it, of Britain's nuclear deterrence, all makes Britain an especially powerful country. So don't play it down the whole time. But with this great power, it comes responsibility. It's the responsibility of the British government to be one of the great leaders of the Western world. And this is a time when the Western world needs to approach global challenges with a great deal more self-confidence than it's been showing in recent years. We should all be prepared without hesitation to stand up for our political systems and our values. I think we have seen, by the way, a magnificent demonstration of this in just the last few days. Not only did the British government react robustly to the chemical weapons attack in Salisbury, but it's brought to bear the power of Britain to corral the great network of Western allies at long last to stand up to Russian intransigence. I'm proud that Australia has joined with so many like-minded allies from the great democracies of the world to expel undeclared Russian spies from Canberra. For once, Russia has learned that the Western alliance really does have some backbone, and it's in this case not Britain, it's Britain, sorry, in this case it's Britain, not America, which has led the alliance. So I say to the British government and the British people, congratulations on a job very well done. So my parting words are that after 4 years as the High Commissioner here, this is without doubt one of the greatest countries on earth. Its people have huge resilience and an underlying and understated patriotism which needs to be encouraged. There are many Jeremiahs in the media, people who claim Britain is past its best, people who say Britain no longer has a major role to play in the world, people who describe Britain as just a middle power. You must never allow yourselves to be dragged down by this pervasive sense of pessimism and defeatism. Don't let that control your destiny. This is a great country with a great deal to contribute in the future. And as I move from the glamour of the court of St. James up the ladder to the chairmanship of Policy Exchange, I look forward to working closely with you all in the years ahead. Thank you very much.
Commissioner very kindly agreed to answer questions. Usual Policy Exchange House rule, no question too outrageous. You just have to state your name and organisation first. I imagine there'll be many takers. Gentleman there in the middle row.
David Shields, Wilson College, Cambridge. High Commissioner, at the beginning you mentioned you've been here for 2 referendums, and I just wondered what your take on the Scottish situation now, and thinking also about Northern Ireland. Is the British Union safe?
Well, I was delighted with the result of the Scottish referendum, I'll tell you that, and I probably didn't say too much about it publicly at the time, but I have to say it was my judgment that if Scotland had broken off from the UK, even though it's 5 million people out of 65 million people, it would have had a huge, and journalists always use the word huge, but it would have had a huge impact on Britain's standing in the world. It would have diminished this country very substantially if Scotland had left the Union. So I was delighted that the good people of Scotland, I have some Scottish ancestry myself, that the good people of Scotland voted to remain in the Union. My sense now is, 2.5 years on from that, no more than that, 3.5 years on from that time, that the enthusiasm for the project is beginning to decline, for the independence project in Scotland. But we'll have to wait and see. I mean, it's worth noting that the Quebec referendum, not the first one, I think the second one, came within 1% of passing. But now it wouldn't be considered as a serious proposition. And I don't get any sense. In the case of Northern Ireland, what I should say about Northern Ireland is just that we've been great supporters of the Good Friday Accords. There's a lot of debate here about how the border question will be resolved when the UK leaves the EU. It's a long story, but I think there's a path through there. I think that will be resolved. And under the Good Friday Agreement, the people of Northern Ireland will make up their minds over the years whether they want to continue to remain in the UK or should they wish to leave. But there doesn't again be much sign that there is great inclination to leave the UK. So I think business as usual overall. Let's not be too pessimistic. I mean, business as usual is good news, and I think that will remain the case.
A lot of questions. Gentleman there, with front there on the left, yeah. Name and organisation.
Barney Trimble. I've read quite a bit about the possibility of a Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and UK freedom of movement area. Do you think this is either feasible or indeed desirable?
No, I don't think Australia would go down that path. I mean, we have an open approach, if you like, to people visiting Australia, but everybody who comes to Australia has to have a visa. So we would maintain our visa system, and for people from the UK, it's an electronic visa like the American ESTA, although different from the American ESTA. I think that costs $14, whereas ours is free. So what more is it is in Australia? So I think we will continue with that system. I think what we're looking for is something different. With the UK, we're looking for something like the visa arrangements we have with the Americans. When we negotiated our free trade agreement with the United States, and I was the foreign minister at the time, so I'm going quickly to take some credit for that. We also negotiated what's called an E3 visa. This is a visa that only Australians are eligible for, and it gives Australian business and professional and tradespeople the opportunity to go to work in the United States for 2 years, and it's renewable every 2 years. So it gives us much freer access, if you like, to the United States than would be the case without the E3 visa. And we would like to have something like that with the UK, and obviously you'd like it to be reciprocal, and we could look at how we could do that as well. So we would like to ease up the visa arrangements a bit, but I don't think you're going to leap from the current relationship you have with the EU on immigration to a situation where you just allow free movement from those Commonwealth countries, and you know, it creates questions as to why you would choose those countries and not, you know, India or Pakistan or somewhere else. You've got to think through all of those issues. You'll get yourself into a terrible tangle if you try to go down that path, I suspect, politically. So you've got to be very careful how you handle these things. But I think we can do better on visas than is currently the case with the UK. And I think there are something like 400,000 Australians, many of whom have become dual nationals, who live here. And it gives me the opportunity to make this point, that there are more British-born people living in Australia than any other country in the world. For those of you who are Brexiteers, you will like to hear that there are more British-born people living in Australia than the whole of the EU 27. So there you are. So you're already getting a bit of access to Australia.
Lady there, just with name and organisation.
Annabelle Hennessy from News Corp Australia. You mentioned briefly that Australia's policies in terms of ensuring migrants speak English help just with integration. Do you think Britain should start investigating introducing similar policies here?
Well, you know, far be it for me to preach to the British, but one of the observations I'd make is that very recently Sajid Javid, the Communities Secretary, announced that they were spending, I think as memory serves me well, somebody will correct me, £50 million on English language training because there were allegedly, I think debatably, I think this is said to be very debatable, over 700,000 people here who can't speak English or can speak very little English. I mean, I think this issue of getting the balance right between respecting people's traditions and their cultures on the one hand, but integrating them into the mainstream of society is one of the things that we haven't always done well, by the way, in Australia, but we do pretty well. We have largely integrated people, be they from China or from India or from Africa or wherever they're from, obviously the UK and so on, quite successfully into Australia. I just made the point that clearly over the years, this is no reflection on the current government, but over the years, integration hasn't worked as well here. And there are all sorts of social tensions that can emerge from that. So people, I mean, there are many things that unify people. There are things that divide them. There are things that divide you and me. But I haven't analysed them. But there are many things that divide people, but there are things in a country that really unify them. And a lot of those things are values, a sense of right and wrong. Some of them are customs and traditions, and one of them is in a largely monolingual country like this. I know you have Welsh and Gaelic and so on, but it's largely a monolingual country. It's language. And that's true in Australia too. I mean, one of the things that binds us together is language. So if you can't speak the lingua franca of the country, it's very hard to, get jobs and achieve the social mobility you want. And then, people become, in that situation, become dispirited and sad, disadvantaged, and social problems emerge from that. So I think it's one of the great challenges of our age. I'm a liberally minded person, so I don't mind where people come from. I'm ambitious that they, when they come to Australia, should be able to work in with Australian society successfully, and I think we've largely achieved that. And I think here that should be a significant policy ambition of any British government. And I think, to be fair, the present government has talked quite a lot about that.
The front here, the way.
Jonathan Isby from Brexit Central. My affection for Australia, by the way, is directly attributable to discovering Kylie Minogue at the age of 9. And your affection...
That's rather a reflection on Kylie, because she still looks very young.
And your affection for the UK came across tonight, and it's come across throughout your time here, and indeed your confidence in this country and the optimism for our future, which I only wish all the commentariat and political class would share. I wonder how can we continue to take advantage of your wisdom on all of this? You're obviously about to leave the diplomatic service of the Australian government. You are going to stay in London for some time. Are you? Would you be willing, if the UK government offered you some kind of advisory role, would you be interested in taking up something like that?
Well, I'm an Australian man. I do love Britain. I have to admit to having a huge affection for this country. People used to say when I was the foreign minister I came here too often. I don't know about that. I have a daughter who's married to a Briton, and my wife is British. She comes from North Derbyshire, so that means my mother-in-law is British. And I rush to North Derbyshire to see her whenever I can. I'm going to become the chairman of Policy Exchange, and I'll just see where the future takes me. But I certainly want to spend a lot of my time here and some of my time back in Australia. I think, I have noticed a sort of sense of pessimism here. How would I put it? I would say people in Australia and in America are more optimistic naturally than they are here. So let's say, and this doesn't apply to you, by the way, but let's say you're a Remainer and you lost in the referendum. What to do? Well, you could just be depressed, or you could think about, well, how are we going to make the best of this? So we have a wonderful, very simple expression in Australia when things aren't going too well. And let's be honest, Australians always sound sunny and optimistic, don't they? But things go really wrong in Australia, as we've seen in the last week. We have that's been really bad for us, in my view. I think it's been terrible for our national reputation, what the cricket team did. But we have a great expression in Australia, which I think comes from the First World War soldiers known as diggers. Like you'd say squaddies, we say diggers. Our First World War diggers, and they really did have a hard time. But we still use this expression today, she'll be right, mate. She'll be right. So you voted for Brexit, and some of you will think, hooray, isn't that great? Sunny uplands ahead. Some of you voted for Remain, and you lost. So you best think she'll be right. Because, look, how you perform once you leave the European Union is going to depend more on the domestic economic policies you pursue than almost anything else. The brutal truth is that some countries in the European Union, like Germany, the Benelux countries and so on, have done really well out of being in the European Union, and some not so well. And some countries outside of the European Union, like my country, which has had more than 26 years of continuous economic growth, have managed to scrape by outside of the European Union. So the issue in Switzerland and Norway, So the issue is, how well do you run your domestic economy? How good are your domestic economic policies? As I was saying in my speech, how good is your tax policy, your labour market policies? How well integrated are these? What about your fiscal policy? And do you have creative policies which contribute to productivity? Are you always, every country has its sacred cows, and you have yours here, just as we do. You have one or two sacred cows here within which productivity may be rather low. Would you ever make any changes to the structures of some of your services and industries which would lead to substantial improvements in productivity and maybe more private sector investment? Could you ever imagine that? These are the things that are going to drive you into the future. And that's why I sort of emphasize this. I think I've written it quite poorly in the speech, but these are the things that it's really important to concentrate on. You're going to leave the European Union, you probably get some sort of free trade agreement with the European Union, go up, negotiate trade with other countries. But what is trade as a percentage of your GDP? So it's I think about 20. Looking for Warwick, he's going to tell me. It's about that. That means 70 or 80% of your economy is not generated by trade. How well are you going to run that? So, these are the big questions that a country needs to be debating. Never stop debating it. Because one of our experiences in Australia is that when we stop the process of economic reform, we start to do less well. We always need to keep the process of economic reform going in our country. And I think I'm going to offer you a bit of advice. You need to do that here.
Gentleman there in the middle, several rows back. Did you want?
Sorry. High Commissioner, you mentioned earlier the importance of the EU and indeed other countries not turning away from the transatlantic relationship once Britain leaves the EU. And some of us can't help but turn away from the soap opera in the White House and in senior levels of the American government leadership in recent times. I wonder if you had any observations on the impact of the sort of current administration and the potential for a fall in America's standing in the world, what that might have on other liberal democracies like the UK, Australia, the EU, in the rest of the world.
Well, there's an old saying in our country, Asians are Republicans and Europeans are Democrats. So in Asia, for example, George W. Bush was very popular. And Ronald Reagan, when I was here when Ronald Reagan became the President of the United States, and people just threw their hands up in horror. This was the worst imaginable decision these mad people over on the other side of the Atlantic had made. With Donald Trump, I think the important thing is he is a very different sort of person in politics. I was going to say politician, but I would say person in politics. From somebody like me, who's a sort of white-bread, pretty stock standard man in a dark suit, politician. So he's something else. On the other hand, judge what he does. It's best and it's wisest to judge his tweets are not going to affect you and me, but what he does is going to potentially affect you and me. There have been things, to be frank, we've been disappointed in. we don't like his penchant for protectionism in terms of international trade. I choose my words cautiously here because Australia has been given exemption from the tariffs on aluminium and steel, so I think this is a very wise decision of the President, who reminds us should judge him by his actions. I don't know what will happen to you, because for Britain, its fate is linked with the rest of the EU, because you'll get an EU exemption or not. You won't get a separate British one. Mind you, when you leave the EU, you get a separate British one. Somebody could play with that argument. I think in terms of foreign policy, so his language is one thing, but I'm going to use this one example because it's very au courant. He has been very tough on North Korea and on China over North Korea. And people who hate him will give him no credit for anything. I give him some credit. I do give him some credit for the recent and positive developments on the Korean Peninsula. This morning we heard about Kim Jong-Un's visit to Beijing and the several days he spent there, and nice messages, reassuring and positive messages are sort of emerging from Beijing. Well, I think he ramped up the rhetoric for sure, but he changed the dynamics of an issue which has been stuck for a very long time. So, I think we'll ultimately judge him by what he does. I think, a lot of people in America would say the tax cuts he's made, the changes he's made to the regulatory regime there have given the economy a real boost. The economy was recovering anyway, but they've given it a real boost. And so, I give credit where it's due. Personally, I do have a Twitter account, and one or two of you here who I recognise follow it, and I think you'd agree it would be summed up in one word, and that word would be boring. And that's what I'm paid to be as a High Commissioner. On Twitter.
Yes, gentleman there on the far side.
Alex Carlisle from House of Lords. In a couple of weeks, you'll be extremely busy with the Commonwealth Heads of Government meeting in London. Yet you haven't mentioned the Commonwealth at all. The media have barely mentioned Jong-Un themselves in recent times. Is the Commonwealth now anything more than a social club? What do you expect the Commonwealth to be, if anything, in 10 years' time?
Yeah, well, it's a good question though, and it's well phrased. I think your question, because it does get to a question about the Commonwealth, which is that it's great to get 53 countries together, and this Commonwealth Heads of Government is going to bring, at last count, because these things change, but at last count, 52 of the 53 Heads of Government together here in London in what will be a spectacular performance. And there's a really interesting agenda that has been developed, but it's pretty hard. It's pretty hard to take the Commonwealth, if you like, that step further. So let me illustrate it by two areas of public policy, having been a foreign minister, which were preeminent for me: national security and the economy. Now, when I look at the Commonwealth, it's hard to bind those countries together on national security issues. We've set up a Countering Violent Extremism, CVE unit, which we in the British government have funded, which is just getting going. So can the Commonwealth help us with countering violent extremism in different ways? I'm just trying to remember how much money has gone into it, but like $20–30 million, something like that, or perhaps 10–15 million pounds over 5 years. So it's not like a huge unit. And when you look at somewhere, just what are the great security threats to the world today? There's Russia, the suite of issues there. There's South China Sea. There's the Korean Peninsula. We'll just take those, and then there's Islamic terrorist activity and other sorts of terrorism. Actually, terrorist activities generally. How can the Commonwealth contribute to us having a sense that it will fix those problems? Its work is more grist to the mill. It can be a help, but it's not going to change the face of those issues in the way great alliances are going to. I mean, they're sometimes called the West. We're not very Western physically, but we are politically. The Great Western Alliance, the Transatlantic Alliance plus Japan, South Korea, Australia, this great and tight alliance of nations is axiomatic to a successful world and to upholding the rules-based international system. Is the Commonwealth ad idem in supporting that great alliance? Not really. They are indifferent. Some of them are. Australia, for example, Canada, the UK, but it's not that straightforward. And when it comes to the economics, I mean, a lot of people will say, well, why don't we have a Commonwealth free trade agreement? We used to have the system of imperial preferences. So why can't we kind of recreate a modern version of that with a Commonwealth free trade agreement? Well, that would be fine if everyone in the Commonwealth thought free trade was a great idea. And one of the problems is that many of the developing countries in the Commonwealth think that free trade is one of those things that rich countries do. I think they've got the horse and the cart in the wrong order there. One of the reasons those countries are rich is because they do have free trade. As I love to say, I challenge you to name a country which is an open, free trading country which is poor, or one that has a closed economy which is rich. So in the Commonwealth, there's a great mix of views on those things. So I've laboured the answer a bit by telling you that this makes it quite difficult. So what binds the Commonwealth together? Yes, nearly all of these countries were, don't dare one mention it here, but these countries were what? Members of the British Empire, with two exceptions, Mozambique and Rwanda. So what binds them together is, amongst the elites anyway, the use of the common language. Most of them have a similar British-based common law system, and they have common law traditions. And they embrace through the Commonwealth Charter the values of democracy and pluralism and freedom of speech and expression. And I mean, they don't always practice these things across university across 53 countries. And they have a mechanism within the Commonwealth for upholding those values of the Commonwealth. And I reckon that's good. I think that's very good. The way the Commonwealth professes to be and is a force for democracy. And getting 53 or 52 leaders together talking about the problems of the world, be it climate change or problems with oceans, or of course the eternal challenge of trying to deal with the problems of poverty, war and peace issues and so on, it's got to be a good thing. But it's not as big a thing as some of the other arrangements that we're all involved in other parts of the world.
Just a couple more questions at a time. There was someone at the back who was trying to get my name and organisation.
Philip Dunn, Member of Parliament for Ludlow. High Commissioner, you partly answered my question in responding to the Commonwealth. I was going to ask your perception of the role of NATO and the relevance of NATO to Australia, and whether or not, in the context of just your answer about the Great Western Alliance, including Japan and South Korea, obviously not members of NATO, how relevant is it to Australia, and is it the Five Eyes which really gives you the bang for your buck?
Well, I think you know of course about it yourself, but the Five Eyes arrangement isn't something that we spend a huge amount of time boasting about or talking about, but one or two of you in this room know all about it. And I think it is, this is the phrase I'd use, a great force multiplier for our countries. It obviously binds us very closely, your country and my country. I mean, the three of us have the greatest intelligence effort amongst the five. And this really binds us very closely together in lots of different fora. So you know what, that underlines something I've often talked about here. There is a measure of trust between Australia and the UK, the like of which doesn't really exist with almost, not quite, but almost any other country for us. We have a lot of trust in New Zealand, but the level of trust with the Americans and so on, but the level of trust we have with the UK is quite intimate. And this is sort of a function of the Five Eyes arrangement. We can share secrets and things with each other. We are expanding the Five Eyes, not in numbers, in terms of activities, to all sorts of things, talking with each other about CVE issues, terrorism, counter-terrorism. We're talking much more with each other about defence collaboration. For a long time, of course, once the Australian and British Defence Forces were almost one, I think 40% of the soldiers fighting in the Australian Imperial Force who landed at Gallipoli on the 25th of April 1915 were actually born in the UK. So, once our defence forces were almost enmeshed together, then they just went far apart from each other. In recent years, they've really started to come back together again. And we're looking at all sorts of different ways of developing our collaboration with each other. So let's just go to NATO. I mean, NATO is fundamental to Western security. And NATO has now, as they like to say, reached out to countries like Australia, Japan, Korea and New Zealand and so on. And I think this is really important to do. I think this is a project we've got to work on. We've got to find a way of the great upholders of the Western Alliance and the rules-based international system, whether they're in Asia or whether they're in Europe or they're in the Americas. We've got to find ways of them getting together more often to talk about strategic issues and try to coordinate their policies. I heard from a very senior Japanese civil servant how successful the G7 was during the time of the aforementioned Ronald Reagan, as sitting around, and I think Nakasone must have been the Japanese Prime Minister at the time, sitting around and talking about geopolitical challenges and trying to get those 7 countries to coordinate not just their economic policies, but their security policies. And there isn't much of that these days. There isn't much of an effort to do that. And I think this is a challenge in terms of building institutions. Do we need a new institution or build on existing, probably better to build on existing institutions to try to get the leaders of those great alliance countries to talk to each other together about the geopolitical challenges we have, the rise of China, on specific issues like North Korea. What do we do about Russia? How is this country, with an economy no bigger than Australia's, how is this country getting away with this sort of behaviour? I don't think we should allow this anymore. I think we should stop this. They need to have this discussion. So I think it's a great question, and it still needs more work.
Sorry to disappoint anyone, but we have a rule not going on beyond an hour, and it's a big theme on which you ended. We're looking forward to it. Thank you all for coming. We look forward to seeing much more of Alexander in the months and years to come. Please join me in expressing appreciation for